Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Monday morning, October 21st, 2019. Today, we're talking about Syria, not the nitty-gritty details of which troops are going where and which ones are not going where and who's defending who and all of that kind of all the mechanics of what's going on, but instead how the entire situation gives us a serious and important lesson about war powers under the Constitution. And the short version is, for a long time, it's been a serious mess. First of all, my name is Michael Bolden. We're broadcasting live as we do every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. We broadcast live through our channels at YouTube, Periscope, DLive, Twitch, and Facebook. Plus, we have archived video versions at Brighteon.com and BitChute. Plus, of course, we have the audio-only podcast edition, which more and more people are tuning into. When I first started the show in July of 2018, I really didn't even, it was an afterthought to do a podcast, but a lot of people started asking, hey, I'm like listening to this at work and trying to cover up my phone. Can you just do an audio edition? So I started doing a podcast a few months after, and we're getting a lot more listeners and a lot of reviews, and I'm very, very grateful for that. Find all of our archives, all the places to follow us, like our social media channels, our email newsletter, all the ways to subscribe to the show, plus ways to support us financially over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I hope you guys had a really good weekend. I had a great one. I've got next weekend is going to be pretty awesome. I'm speaking at the annual Mises Supporters Summit. Oh, you can find out details of that under events over at Mises.org. I'll be there with Jeff Deist, Tom Woods, Lou Rockwell, David Gordon, and a number of other people. So that's really exciting. And for those of you who are going to be at that event, I really look forward to hanging out with you there. But before getting into it, let's take a look over at the live chat. Richard Kramer, good morning to all, and good morning to you as well. Hi to EHP Training. Holly Carter, Heather Rossi, good to see you as well. Justin Bayola, Sabalytic, Curtis Burnett, Bob Brewer, good to see you, buddy. I always appreciate your feedback. And whether you guys are here live and chatting and leaving your thoughts live in the live chat or later on in the archives, I'm always grateful for the feedback. I read through all of it. I don't always get a chance to respond to everybody, but I do get a lot of interesting suggestions for show ideas too. You can also email me over at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Oh, Richard Kramer had a heart attack wow. And you're still... Oh, I hope you get a full, quick recovery on that. It's good to see you here with good energy, Richard, and I hope you get fully healthy and don't have any type of recurring problem going forward. Anyways, let's get into it. So if you're like me, you're probably having a hard time following just what's going on with this whole Syria situation. I know everyone wants to break it down and tell you how easy it is. Well, if you just understand what's going on here, then you're going to know that so-and-so is a bad guy or so-and-so is a good guy or kind of doing good or bad things or troops are going here or that. To me, honestly, I've been reading through a lot of this. I've been listening to a lot of podcasts. Of course, Scott Horton is my go-to guy on his podcast, but it isn't necessarily easy to follow the day-to-day movements. Getting the truth really isn't easy at all. Sometimes you'll hear the same people say one thing and then something's completely different a few hours later. I think in a way, a lot of this is just intentional misdirection to keep our heads spinning, but that's an entirely different episode altogether. Let's just go through a couple of examples. First of all, here, the president tweeted, I guess, a couple of days ago, the ceasefire is holding up nicely. There are some minor skirmishes that have ended quickly. New areas are being resettled with the Kurds. USA soldiers are not in combat or ceasefire zones. He was actually tweeting the new Secretary of Defense, and I know everybody wants to talk about the fact that he got the name wrong rather than what's going on, and of course, it's just more and more quibbling about nitty-gritty stuff. And he says, USA soldiers are not in combat or ceasefire zones. We have secured the oil, bringing the soldiers home. But sure enough, that was deleted, probably because of the name error, and then it was changed slightly. He quoted the Secretary of Defense, and instead of saying, bringing soldiers home, which is what he should be saying over and over and over, whether it's just 50 soldiers or 5,000. He changed it. And of course, he says we're ending endless wars. And that is also, ending wars is very positive. But I don't know. It's hard to tell what's actually going on there. Are they coming home? Are they ending the war? What's going on? If you look into it a little further, it's still even messier. We hear in this report that they're actually being moved to Iraq, not coming home. And maybe that's why it was changed. And maybe he still wants to bring them home. I'm not sure. But check out this report from Common Dreams. President Donald Trump tweeted Sunday that he is bringing soldiers home from Syria as Turkey continues its deadly military operation there. Of course, a lot of this is there's a particular slant that's going on there. And again, I don't know the truth of what these words are, but we do know that that Mark Esper did undermine the president's declaration of coming home by confirming that U.S. forces are simply moving to another site of endless war, Iraq. So if there's going to be coming home, that's great. And I know that the establishment consensus would be against that. But if they aren't coming home, we don't want to hear that they're coming home. I'd rather get the hard truth than not. And maybe that's why it was deleted. I don't know. But going on, Esper told reporters that he has spoken to Iraqi leaders about the administration's plan to move around 1,000 troops from Syria to Iraq, where 5,000 U.S. soldiers remain stationed 16 years after the George W. Bush administration's catastrophic and illegal invasion. Of course, I do want to point out that Common Dreams is a left-leaning, hard left website, and they've been very good on opposing war for a long time. Not always, but they've often been very good on this. But unfortunately, I think they only oppose it in a partisan nature, because when they're talking about 16 years against the Bush administration's catastrophic and illegal invasion, if you don't say that it also continued with the Obama occupation, you're actually making it seem like it's just a Republican thing. They just skip over the guy in the middle there. It's just Bush and just Trump moving troops into Iraq. And I think that's a big part of the problem. A lot of people are just making perspectives and commentary about this from their own partisan biases, that Team A is bad and Team B is good or less bad, so we're going to just ignore what Team B does to point out how the current people in office are awful. I experienced this in a big way as an anti-war activist for quite a long time. Before I started the 10th Amendment Center, my only activism really, I had done some work on the Middle East situation, Israel and Palestine, but then I got really involved when it came to the war in Iraq in 2003. And there was huge opposition to the war when Bush was in office from the left, from the hard left, from the mainstream left. But as soon as Obama came in office, those tens of thousands of people that we saw on the streets opposing war just disappeared. So unfortunately, this plays out for real. And I think when you make it a partisan thing, you're only going to end up with more of the same, because then your guy thinks, or your team thinks, they can get away with whatever. But that's kind of a side note. So not really sure exactly what's going on. We're getting conflicting reports. The Esper could be lying. Trump could be lying. The media could be lying. It's hard to really know if you're not on the ground. But I did an episode of this show back in January about some of the deep state spin. I think that the establishment, the deep state, whatever you want to call them, they love keeping our heads spinning, not really knowing what's going on. We also get a lot of propaganda. And I talked about how this is not something that's brand new. Of course, a lot of the opposition to what's happening, moving of 50 troops or a couple hundred troops or 1,000 troops, whatever, they talk about Trump's move as being somehow rash and sudden and out of nowhere. And I talked about this in January as well, how it was supposedly sudden and out of nowhere. But of course, most people forget that this has actually been going on for more than just a few weeks. It's been going on since beyond January, probably well over a year and close to 2 years plus, that there has been an attempt to withdraw from Syria, and it's being resisted. Just a quick overview. We can go back to March of 2018. We've got some public statements, and I covered this in that last episode. I'll have links to all of this in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. But for example, I mentioned in that episode that in March of 2018, there was a rally in Ohio about health care. And Trump was speaking at this, and out of nowhere, he says, quote, "We're coming out of Syria, like very soon. Let the other people take care of it now. Very soon we're coming out." And whether or not we can debate whether or not there's actually been a real withdrawal or troops are coming home or not, we can get distracted with all that. But there has been this underlying message that's going on and on and on. And you're hearing this from a guy who almost never defends President Donald Trump. When it comes to the Constitution, I think he's terrible. But on this, at least his rhetoric has been pretty consistent all along. He says, we're coming out of Syria very soon, in March. Then we learn in April of 28, he was impatient. He wanted to get out. If he was talking about it in March in Ohio, and I mentioned this in the previous episode back in January, it is very likely that he was trying to make it happen already, and he was just getting frustrated and just started saying, look, okay, this is going to go down. This is how it's going. And then a month later, we learn that in a National Security Council meeting, he had a big conflict with his team. And he said, look, we need to have a totally different policy in Syria. James Mattis, who was there at the time, told him that an immediate withdrawal would be irresponsible. You can't carry it out responsibly. It's going to be dangerous. So Trump then relented and said they could have 5 or 6 months to destroy the Islamic State and then get the hell out of there. This was in April of 2018. So we're talking about by September or October of 2018. And then there was still no withdrawal at that point. So then in December of 2018, December of last year, Trump is totally frustrated again. And supposedly we're told by the media that in December, when he ordered another withdrawal, that it was out of nowhere. And that's what the media tells us. We're hearing that any move to pull troops out of occupying or being engaged in a foreign conflict, whether it's a few dozen or a few thousand, is sudden, out of nowhere, abandoning people and the like. But if he had been working on this for months, then announced it in March, and then in April said, you guys have 4 or 5 or 6 months, and then in December, after that 4 or 5, 6 months passed by a couple months, says, look, we got to get out of here. I keep saying we're getting out of here. You guys need to make it happen. And then the media goes nuts saying, oh, out of nowhere, he's saying we're getting out of Syria. We're abandoning people. And so here, December 31st, 2018, here's the New York Times. President Trump has agreed to give the military about 4 months. So after all the backlash in mid-December-ish of 2018, he's like, okay, 4 months. Get out of there in 4 months to withdraw the 2,000 U.S. troops in Syria, backtracking from his abrupt order 2 weeks ago that the military pull out within 30 days. Of course, they're calling it an abrupt order, even though he's been telling them, look, you guys got to come up with a plan for nearly a year. It's not abrupt. They're just not doing it because the military establishment doesn't want to get out. Also, in January, hear from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com. He says, in comments surrounding a cabinet meeting Wednesday, this is January 2nd of this year, President Trump reiterated his stance on withdrawing from Syria, saying the country was lost a long time ago and the U.S. is getting out. He added that Syria doesn't have vast wealth, only sand and death. Not that and this is where I disagree with the president too, it doesn't matter how much wealth they have, how much oil, or how many strategic interests. The U.S. government should not be engaged in this other country. Just trade and commerce, not fighting on one side of a war or another, or trying to topple dictators or funding dictators or any of this nonsense. So this has been going on and on and on. But fast forward, and now we're talking about 50 troops or 1,000 troops, a much smaller number. And there is a bipartisan pushback calling this the most insane, out of control, without notice, abrupt withdrawal and abandonment of allies, even though anyone who's paying attention or looking at this lightly knows that without looking at the logistics, which is confusing to me, that at least the messaging has been the same over and over and over. There's another article that I didn't include in my notes today, but basically the president said, look, I don't want to have to defend the Kurds. And I think that was in January. Maybe I can pull it up here. That was in the Telegraph. I'll try to put that link in the show notes as well. And that was the impression that I got from reading that report. Again, I'm not sure if that report was correct or people were misconstruing what he had to say, but who knows? Who knows? But I do know that the message about getting out of Syria has been happening for well over a year. We're now closing into at least 2 years of public comments to get out. And people are going nuts saying this is abandonment. Out of nowhere. Had no idea this was coming. It happened in December. We have such short-term memory here. We don't pay attention. We look at just headlines. And then there's a new headline to keep our head spinning. And then, of course, we forget what happened just a few months ago. So it's the problem, I think, more than anything, is the people, as the general public. But let's go a little further. So the bipartisan outrage boiled over into some action from Congress. And here again from Common Dreams. This is from, I think it was Medea Benjamin. No. Yeah, Medea Benjamin from Code Pink. For some strange reason, they have me blocked on my Twitter, and I can't actually reply to anything ever, but whatever. So here, Trump's fake withdrawal from endless war. So on October 16th, the U.S. Congress snatched the low-hanging political fruit of Trump's muddled policy with a rare bipartisan vote of 354 to 60 to condemn the U.S. redeployment. So, of course, there's some political views that go on in this article that I think are interesting to read just so you understand where people are coming from and the type of messages that they have to say. But where Medea makes a good point is that, like, look, after all this time, finally, Congress is somehow pretending to take a stand or giving a bipartisan message, but it's just a resolution condemning. And she goes on, she says, but this is the same Congress that never mustered the integrity to debate or vote on the fateful decision to send U.S. troops into harm's way in Syria in the first place. And from my understanding, that happened under the previous president. It certainly continues under the current president. It probably happened much earlier if we're thinking about giant CIA black budgets. And I would consider troops, if we're using a broad term, if we're talking about airstrikes and things like that, this has been going on for years. And Congress suddenly has something to say about it, probably so they can go home to their districts and say, look, I'm on the side of protecting the poor Kurds who the U.S. has been treating like garbage for decades. And suddenly, all of a sudden, Congress cares about it because they don't like the current president. But then they're not really. Now, if Congress was actually reasserting their authority under the Constitution, the powers delegated to Congress, not to the executive branch under the Constitution, it would be positive for Congress to reassert that power, even if it was for partisan reasons, because we can't trust that any of these people there actually have good moral motivations at all. So whatever their bad reasons, if they end up doing the right thing, I guess we can push forward in that direction. But they're not even doing the right thing. They're just talking trash. And she goes on and says this vote fails to fulfill Congress's constitutional duty. It's not the worst thing in the world that things have gotten so upside down that people on the far left are now talking about the Constitution when it comes to war powers once again. Now, I'm assuming that will stop like it did once Barack Obama came in office, once another Democrat gets there. But the more that this happens, the more that it gets into the kind of the national psyche, into the conversation. I think that is a positive. I want everyone to talk about the Constitution as far as what government is allowed to do or not. It forces them into uncomfortable situations in the future, because now if Medea, and I'm assuming she'll be consistent on this, but when the next Democrat president comes in and does the same type of thing, engages in more war, and Congress fails to declare war, will she say the same thing? Or will she champion the wrong side? I don't know. But this type of thing I think is very positive. So she says the vote is just political grandstanding. And of course, that's all Congress is doing when it's bipartisan or you find consensus in Washington, D.C. They're either scamming you, ripping you off, stealing your liberty, or just being fakes. So this fails to fulfill Congress's constitutional duty to decide whether U.S. troops should be risking their lives in illegal military operations in Syria, what they are supposed to be doing there, or for how long. Members of Congress from both parties remain united in their shameful abdication of their constitutional authority over America's illegal wars. I could have written something very similar. I would have tweaked a few of those words, but this is absolutely correct. Now, we published an article from Mike Meharry over on Friday, Donald Trump in Syria, a tough lesson about power, and he takes this a little further. He says, in fact, the whole Syria fiasco, at least what we're experiencing now, not the kind of the long process that I'm explaining. I just pointed out what's been going on since early 2018 to point out that the conversation talking about this being abrupt and out of nowhere is propaganda, lies, bullcrap, through and through. But the current fiasco where now the president is doing something unilaterally and everybody else is freaking out, and there's all this crazy back and forth and everyone's distracted by that. He says this reveals exactly why the framers of the Constitution vested war-declaring powers in Congress and not the president. They didn't want a single individual making these decisions based on their own whim. They didn't just trust the chief executive's discretion. Here's what James Madison said in a letter to Thomas Jefferson. The Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrates, that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. It has accordingly, with studied care, vested the question of war in the legislature. So the fact that everyone's complaining that the executive is making this decision, when especially we're talking about Congress having this almost universal vote condemning a unilateral decision by the executive branch on the question of peace or war, literally it's not even that. It's, I mean, I know he's saying he's ending endless wars, but just moving troops around at this point, no wars are really being ended still, whether Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and on. These aren't necessarily being ended unilaterally, but people are complaining that it might be. And they don't like that. But James Madison didn't want it that way, and the Constitution wasn't set up where it was going to be a unilateral decision. He went into further detail on this in one of his letters of Helvidius. I believe it was 1793 that this was written. He says, those who are to conduct a war, this is James Madison, the father of the Constitution, those who are to conduct a war cannot, in the nature of things, be proper or safe judges whether a war ought to be commenced, continued, or concluded. They are barred from the latter functions by a great principle in free government, analogous to that which separates the sword from the purse, or the power of executing from the power of enacting laws. James Madison. Not my view. I mean, it is my view, probably because it is James Madison's view, but because that's what they set up. And Meharry goes on, and he's got some really kind of pointed comments about this. He says, the problem is Congress. The problem, I mean, they're all the problem. But Congress handed the power to declare war. Now, if we understand, just briefly, the power to declare war isn't always just issuing a statement to say that we are at war with another country. It is the power to decide the question of war and peace. Now, if someone attacks you, that question has already been answered, so therefore the president can respond. But if there is no active war happening, no one's attacked, then that question is only in the hands of Congress. And so Mike points out very correctly, the problem is Congress handed that power to the president. They've been doing it for a long time. No constitutionally based declaration of war has happened since World War II. All of them since then have been a violation of the war powers and unconstitutional. He goes on, he says, it passed open-ended authorizations to use force, AUMF, you may hear it called, that placed the decisions about when, where, and if. So that's the problem. The AUMFs that have been passed in more modern times basically say to the president, you decide who, when, and if we're going to have war, when that question is supposed to be in the hands of Congress. They can't just say, well, something bad happened. You can do whatever you feel is necessary. That's not how the Constitution works. That's not what the founders wanted. That's not what James Madison explained it to be over and over and over, and same with many other founders as well. So I guess I should read that again. The problem is Congress handed that power to the president. It passed open-ended authorizations to use force that placed the decisions about when, where, and if to launch military strikes at the complete discretion of the president. And in recent years, The president hasn't even bothered with AUMFs. Congress let them get away with it. And when he says the president, he's not talking, you can read this. If you could go back in time and read this in 1996 or in 2002 or 2010 or today or probably sometime in the future, the president is whoever happens to be in office at that time. And Mike is correct. Congress passed the buck. And now, and this is very timely in consideration of this resolution denouncing the president that passed in Congress by such a wide margin, or in the House at least, 354 to 60. 354 to 60. And now all these Congress critters and the rest of the political establishment wants to complain about it. So for years, for decades, Congress has basically said, you do it because I don't want to take responsibility. And now, and many of them are still in office and talking trash today, now that someone they don't like or someone who's doing things that they don't want them to do uses that power and just says, I'm making a change, then they complain. He says members of Congress need to either reassert their constitutional authority or shut their yaps. Good job, Mike. Members of Congress need to either reassert their constitutional authority or shut their yaps. The president sending troops here, there, and everywhere at the drop of a hat is exactly what virtually everybody asked for. They wanted a president with the power to make war whenever and wherever he pleased. And well, that's exactly what they got. If the president gets to exercise this power, it means he gets to make decisions they don't like. And that's exactly why the founders divided this question of war and peace, put that in the hands of the legislature, and the power to make the war, to carry it out, is in the hands of the executive branch. And that really is the bottom line. Congress should reassert its authority. And actually, my view is that no matter what, it's actually the president's duty under his oath to the Constitution to not wage wars in places that his predecessors were waging them under unconstitutionally delegated authority. So redelegated. So when Congress redelegates a power to George Bush and then to Obama or to Bill Clinton or whoever, the next person doesn't just say, well, the previous guy did it, so I got to continue my commitment. Technically, every day that it continues is a violation of the Constitution, and he's violating his oath. And technically, if there was a good Congress in there, which there clearly isn't, they would impeach him for carrying those out in the first place. If we're talking impeachment, that's what would happen. So efforts to actually end those conflicts are what's supposed to be happening. I don't know, to be honest with you, if that's actually what's happening, if there really is an effort to do this, or if this is political talk. We know politicians talk the talk a lot, but when it comes to walking the walk, I don't know how often that happens. Just taking a look over in the live chat, a lot of interesting back and forth. Athena says, you believe anything the media says about the president? And certainly what the media has been saying in regards, and that's over on DLive. I really appreciate you joining me over there. Certainly the media is just talking garbage. If Obama was doing this, I would assume that the New York Times wouldn't be calling the withdrawal abrupt. They would highlight the fact that the Nobel Peace Prize winning president has decided to pull out of Syria after, well, he bombed the heck out of him or something, didn't he? And of course, Libya and things like that. So yeah, absolutely not. Heather Rossi says this was a campaign promise. And so far, I think he's done a very bad job on keeping that campaign promise. A lot of people, like they did for Obama, supported the change of presidents, change of political party, because they wanted to actually get out of the unconstitutional foreign wars that have been going on for so long. We've had so many presidents over the years, including George W. Bush, that campaigned on a different foreign policy. And Richard Kramer, again, I hope you have a full recovery from what happened last week. The war hawks expanding the warfare state. Thomas Paine told us that wars are the basis for perpetuating taxes. That is a great quote. He said, taxes were not raised to carry on wars. Wars were raised to carry on taxes. He was looking at the British Empire, and I think we can apply that to today. Holly Carter says this whole thing with Kurds in Turkey, Syria, and even Yugoslavia has been going on since I was in high school. I have to date myself by saying that was decades ago. It was for me as well, Holly, so I know what you're feeling. And certainly, this is not some kind of new thing, but And I think the U.S. empire manipulates these different ethnic groups against each other. I think they like conflict like this, and they like the ability to come in and save the day. Of course, they were funding and picking sides between Iraq, Saddam, and Iran. I mean, we see if you look through Google Images, you can find pictures of Donald Rumsfeld with his buddy Saddam Hussein, and then just a few years later, Rumsfeld is leading the charge to kick him out of power. When they pick one side, eventually they go in and dethrone them, and it just creates more and more messes. Holly Carter, another good point. Ignoring constitutional duties and restrictions because of the letter next to a leader's name is what allows constant war to continue. You said it may be a side note, but it's actually a catalyst and not one-sided. Good point. I agree with you, because there doesn't seem to be a support for ending war. So if Obama, with the Iran deal, for example, he was seen as weak and supporting the terrorists by the right. But then if Trump comes in and wants to make a deal then and get troops out, then you find some opposition or support from that on the right. Of course, the neocons are always consistent. At least we know that they're consistent, and they want the U.S. to be engaged everywhere all the time. Justin Bayola, get us out now. I'm on board on that as well. Absolutely, 100%. EHP training. War is money, though. Big business. And that's basically big business for government and government's partners in the contractor industry. Anyways, I hope you guys found this really interesting. I hope it's been educational. I think there's a lot to pay attention to. Anyone telling you that this withdrawal thing is happening out of nowhere is either A, ignorant of what's actually been going on, or B, lying to you. Maybe both. We know for a fact, and I am zero fan of President Donald Trump, and I want to reiterate that because so many people have this thing that if you say something supportive of the president, you must be on Team Trump. You have Trump derangement syndrome. If you say something negative, you have Trump derangement syndrome. I think all of those people have Trump derangement syndrome. But I can actually separate the fact that I don't like him for his constitutional record, which I think is awful like every other modern president, but at the same time, I have to take the position that what he has been saying has been consistent. He has been saying, let's get out of here, been pushing, and then once he finally starts doing it, we get the propaganda that this is coming out of nowhere. We never could have expected this. Wow, just a total abandonment, and I think that's really, really important to watch. So I hope you guys found this educational, interesting. I hope you learned something. I really appreciate you spending some time with me on your Monday, whether it's in the morning or later on in the archives. If you support the show, make sure to smash the like button. Hit subscribe. If you're on YouTube, get bell notifications. On iTunes, I couldn't thank you enough for the reviews, all the great reviews that have been coming in. Thank you so much. And of course, if you support us and you want to kick in financially, $2 a month actually helps us do quite a bit. So when a lot of people pitch in, we can have the funding needed to be able to continue this work, to reach new people, and to grow the effort. So that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, thank you so much for spending some of your Monday with me today. Again, I hope you had an awesome weekend. We'll see you next time here on The Path to Liberty.